Your lecturer is Donald E. Moore III. Dr. Moore is director of the Oregon Zoo and senior science advisor at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. He received his PhD in conservation biology from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Dr. Moore served as a senior scientist for conservation programs for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and helped implement the elephant trails and American trail exhibits at the Smithsonian's National Zoo. He has led workshops in modern zoo management principles and is the author of Wonderful World of Animals.
At the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute in Washington, D.C., down in the southwestern corner, between where the Andean bear cubs frolic and the alpacas amble around the farm looking for a snack, there's an exhibit we call Amazonia. Inside this building, you'll find more than 175 animal species, all native to the world's largest freshwater river basin, the Amazon. You'll see frogs and turtles, salamanders and snakes. There are birds, and of course there are fish, including some of the largest freshwater fish species in the world. It's funny though, if you're not paying close attention, you might miss some of the most beautiful, fascinating, and as it happens, endangered animals in the whole exhibit, even though they're huge and pretty hard to miss. I'm talking about the corals. Look at these things. Look at the colors, the shapes, the incredible fractalized forms. We have more than 30 species of cnidarians in Amazonia, cnidarians being the phylum that corals belong to. Those 30-odd species are just a fraction of the coral species that exist around the world. They're amazing creatures and absolutely vital to the health of our oceans and therefore to the whole planet. But let me ask you something. When you look at a coral, is your first instinct to think that's an animal? Probably not. You might think it's a plant or a fungus or a rock or a something. But I assure you, by every definition of the term, a coral is an animal, just like you and me. Which raises another question. What exactly is an animal? We'll answer that question in just a minute. Hi, I'm Don Moore, Senior Science Advisor to the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute and Director of the Oregon Zoo. In this course, we're going to look at the amazing diversity of animal life and how it came to be. We're going to look at how animals act and interact with their environments and with each other all over the world. And we're going to look at the science of zoology itself. What exactly do zoologists do? As you'll see, we run zoos, but we also study animals in the wild, practice conservation biology, and a heck of a lot more. And in the process, I'm going to take you backstage at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in nearby Front Royal, Virginia. You're going to have a rare opportunity to hear from some of my colleagues about their exciting and important research. You're going to get face-to-face with some of our most popular animals like Bebe the giant panda, as well as some of our hidden gems like corals. So let's get started. I just asked, what exactly is an animal? But before we even go there, let's take it back a step. Have you ever wondered, where did life come from? Based on the fossil record and genetic evidence, we now believe that life began on Earth approximately 4 billion years ago. We call this life form the last universal common ancestor. This was the first thing that we can say wasn't just a self-replicating molecule and was actually a living organism that evolved into all of the organisms that have ever existed on Earth. And boy, have there been a lot of different kinds of life since then. We think there have been more than 1 billion distinct species on Earth through its entire history, and that over 98% of those species are now extinct. In fact, we don't really know how many different species of animals are alive on Earth today. We do know how many we've cataloged, and it's around 1.5 million. But we estimate that the number we haven't cataloged or even discovered range from another million to another 7 million. The very first forms of life were what zoologists call protocells. They each had a membrane and cytoplasm and a number of functional structures in that cytoplasm working together to perform the most basic process we attribute to living things, self-replication. At some point, fairly early on in the evolution of life, the nucleic acids came into being. We could say that this was the moment that life as we know it emerged, because now our common ancestor was self-replicating and passing on its characteristics to its offspring by means of deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid, DNA and RNA. Now, this is not a genetics course, and if you want to understand more about genetics, the Great Courses has other offerings for you. However, a basic understanding of the principles of genetic inheritance and of evolution by means of natural selection are essential for the study of zoology. So here, in the simplest terms possible, is what you need to know. When it comes to building an organism, DNA is the blueprint and RNA is the construction worker. That's it. The single helical RNA molecule reads the instructions for protein building that are encoded in the double helical DNA molecule. And it takes those instructions from each cell nucleus, where the DNA lives, to the other structures in the cytoplasm of the cell, where all other chemical reactions necessary for life take place. When it comes to cell division, or mitosis, the DNA replicates itself. When the replication is complete, the nucleus splits itself in two, then the cytoplasm splits itself in two, and voila, one cell becomes two cells. Easy, right? Well, it's not always easy. As our politicians in Washington like to say, sometimes mistakes were made. Sometimes the replication process doesn't go right, and the DNA of the new cell doesn't quite match the DNA of the old cell. We call these mistakes mutations. But why? Why do mistakes happen? Well, let me put it to you this way. Human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes, that is, molecules of DNA, in each and every one of their somatic cells. That amounts to about 6 billion individual nucleotides, 6 billion bits of information per cell that have to be copied every time one of your cells divides. You try making a copy of 6 billion bits of information without making a single mistake. So, mutation is a natural process. And what's more, it's an important process. It's the process by which evolution occurs. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is one of the 3 pillars of the science of zoology, the other 2 being Gregor Mendel's theory of heredity and Louis Pasteur's experiments disproving the theory of spontaneous generation. All 3 of these date to the middle decades of the 19th century. All 3 are backed up by decades upon decades of excellent work in experimental science. Only Darwin's work remains controversial in popular culture, and I think that's because it's not really well understood. The theory of evolution, as it is taught today, was really laid out by a biologist named Ernst Mayr in the mid-20th century. He taught that Darwin's theory was actually a system of 5 theories. Namely, 1, that the living world is neither static nor cyclical, but is undergoing perpetual change. 2, that all living things descend from a common ancestor in a branching tree of life. 3, that evolutionary processes produce multiplication of species by splitting and transforming older ones. 4, that these processes happen very, very gradually by accumulation of many small changes, not single large changes. And 5, that natural selection determines which changes are advantageous to a population of organisms. thus determining which organisms manage to reproduce and pass their features on to the next generation. For zoologists and for us in this course, natural selection is the most important part of this theory to understand. To help you wrap your head around it, let me compare it first to its related process, something you're probably more familiar with, artificial selection. In the 1950s, a Soviet scientist named Dmitry Belyaev had a theory about foxes. Namely, he thought that he could prove that the first domesticated dogs had been artificially selected and bred for tameness by prehistoric humans. At the time, many people believed that some smart, friendly wolves had just decided to make friends with humans because we were a good source of food, warmth, and companionship, and so they'd tame themselves. Belyaev thought he could prove dogs were deliberately tamed by going through the same process with a close cousin of both dogs and wolves, Vulpes vulpes, the silver fox. Belyaev suggested that the single most important trait those early humans looked for in a prospective wolf companion was not anything about its appearance or abilities. He said we would have looked for one obvious trait: tameability. Makes sense, right? That's what I'd look for if I wanted to make friends with a wolf. So Belyaev got a large number of foxes and began breeding the most tameable ones with each other, ignoring everything else about them: color, size, intelligence, everything. So what did he find? Well, for one thing, the process took a long time in human terms. 40 years of selectively breeding the tamest foxes to each other every single year. That's perhaps faster than it would happen under natural circumstances, and even so, that's a good chunk of time. He also found that his tamed foxes had undergone pedomorphosis. This means that the tamed foxes retain some of their juvenile features into adulthood, things like larger eyes, smaller noses, bigger ears. In a word, they were cuter. This is a phenomenon we had seen in other domesticated animals, everything from dogs and cats to cows and pigs. But it was always believed that at some point back in prehistory, humans had deliberately selected pedomorphosis into their domestic animals. Belyaev's work suggested something else. That when we artificially selected for tameness in these animals, the juvenile traits and cuteness came along with it. That's artificial selection, when humans intentionally direct the breeding of animals or plants. It doesn't matter whether we're creating a labradoodle or building a better banana. The idea is the same. The farmer, breeder, or scientist selects the desired trait and gets more of that trait in the next generation by giving certain organisms a reproductive advantage. In natural selection, nature does the same exact thing, except the selection isn't a conscious process. Nature isn't deciding which traits to breed into the next generation. Instead, when a series of mistakes occur in DNA replication, this gives rise to a change in the next generation of animals, and those that survive and reproduce best provide offspring that continue the selection process. Let's say, just for argument's sake, that we're talking about Arctic foxes, and that a series of mutations gives one group thicker fur than the group of foxes living on the other side of the hill. If this thicker fur helps them survive the next winter better than the thin-furred foxes, then next year the thick-furred foxes have more babies than the thin-furred foxes. And the thick-furred foxes' babies have thick fur, and their babies grow up to mate with thick-furred foxes and thin-furred foxes. And more of those babies have thick fur, and the thicker-furred grandbabies survive the next winter, and so on and so on. That's an oversimplification, but it does represent the idea behind natural selection. It works on individuals within whole populations, not just on individuals in isolation. And it comes about because of the interaction of the individual with its population and its environment. If enough changes accumulate in a population, generation after generation, natural selection may create a whole new species over time. But you may ask, what is a species? Here we have a whole new question, and I haven't even told you what an animal is yet. And you thought I'd forgotten, hadn't you? Well, animal is one of the top level divisions of the phylogenetic tree, or tree of life. The tree on which we map out all the relationships between all the millions and millions of species on Earth. Species are the smallest, lowest division on that tree, the leaves, if you will. Although technically there are subspecies and even breeds when we're talking about domestic animals, we're mainly going to be concerned with the species level because of how a species is defined. By definition, and this is Ernst Mayr's definition, by the way, a species is a reproductive community of populations reproductively isolated from other species that occupies a specific niche in nature. It's not about what an organism looks like or how it behaves, but whether or not it can produce offspring with other similar organisms that survive in the same habitat. This is why, disturbing as the image might be, a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are members of the same species. Animal, on the other hand, has a pretty interesting definition, and I don't think it's immediately intuitive. I'm going to give you a minute to try to work it out for yourself. Try to bring to mind all the different types of animals in the world, from elephants to turtles to fish to birds to dogs to insects to humans, of course, and even the creatures I started this lecture with, the corals. Everything you can think of. What's the one trait we all have in common? What do I have in common with, say, a great white shark, a monarch butterfly, and a house cat? Do you think you have it? Okay, here it is. An animal, by definition, is a multicellular organism that eats other organisms. We don't photosynthesize like plants. We don't ferment like yeast. We don't chemosynthesize like bacteria. We don't absorb dissolved molecules like mushrooms. We eat other organisms. That's it. That's the only thing we all have in common. And it's what makes the animal kingdom as broad and diverse as it is. So now let's look at the phylogenetic tree, the tree of life, and at the different divisions along the path from kingdom to species. Somewhere along the line, you probably learned the mnemonic King Philip came over from Germany Saturday, or something pretty similar to that. It stands for kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The modern taxonomic classification system has 6 kingdoms. Of course, we're only studying one, Animalia. Within the animal kingdom, there are several dozen phyla, divided into more than 100 classes, thousands of orders, hundreds of thousands of genera, and as I said, millions of species. There's another, more modern method of classification called cladistics. A clade is determined by the presence of shared characteristics that are developed over evolutionary time. These characteristics can be traced back to the group's most recent common ancestor, but are not found in more distant ancestors. The taxonomy you're familiar with looked at animals as existing on a particular level. For example, you have mammalian herbivores that have the shared characteristic of eating plants, and mammalian carnivores that have the shared characteristic of eating meat. That distinction is on the order level, the herbivore orders and the carnivore order, and there are many species within each order. The level above that, mammalia, is the class level. All of those animals we call mammals have a couple of shared characteristics, one of which is feeding their newborns with milk. Reptiles don't make milk, they're in a different class, and so on. All of that is still valid, but cladistics looks at taxonomy from a multidimensional perspective. A clade classifies organisms across multiple levels, so it includes a species and all of the species that are descended from that ancestor. If species are the leaves on the tree of life, then think of a clade as a group that includes a branch, all the sub-branches, all the sub-sub-branches, and all the leaves. And you can have clades within clades, depending on which branch you start from. The reason this is important is because while a class or a family or an order might tell us who a species' closest relatives are. A clade helps us describe how a species got there. The grouping itself demonstrates the process of evolution from a common ancestor. Now, a minute ago, I gave you a very vague number of known species. That's because the specific scientific classification of animals is changing all the time as the genetic evidence and fossil records improve. Now, I'm not saying you're going to wake up one morning to the news that your dog is a cat. I'm saying that modern zoological research is discovering subtle but important differences between species that aren't necessarily apparent to the naked eye. Let me give you an example. In the 20-teens, a group of zoologists at Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History set about solving a 500-year-old taxonomic puzzle. Caribbean monk seals are a recently extinct seal species that used to be found, as you'd expect, all over the Caribbean Sea. When European explorers came to the Caribbean in the late 1400s, they recognized that this seal must be a close cousin of the Mediterranean monk seal from back home. As European expansion continued, they also encountered a Hawaiian species of monk seals. Early taxonomists were comfortable calling them all monk seals because of their physical characteristics. They have long, slender bodies, broad snouts, and small earless heads, and the males have dark fur, while the females have lighter fur. The name monk seal comes from the thick fold of skin around their necks, which early European explorers thought looked like a monk's cowl. They eat the same type of diet and demonstrate the same type of mating, child-rearing, and social behaviors. So all three species were placed in the same genus, Monachus. For several hundred years, we had Monachus monachus in the Mediterranean, Monachus tropicalis in the Caribbean, and Monachus shaunslandi in Hawaii. Incidentally, that Hawaiian seal has a suspiciously German-sounding name because the scientist who published the first description of the seal named it after himself. That happens a lot. So we knew for a long time that these animals shared a lot of physical characteristics. In other words, they had a similar morphology. That's been the gold standard of taxonomy reaching all the way back to the dawn of science. But modern zoologists have something more to work with. We have DNA. Although the last living Caribbean monk seal was spotted in 1952, Smithsonian scientists were able to extract DNA samples from century-old sealskins in the museum collections. Working with scientists from Fordham University in New York and the Leibniz Institute in Germany, they compared this DNA to that of living Hawaiian and Mediterranean monk seals, and they made a remarkable discovery. It turns out that the Hawaiian and Caribbean species are much more similar to each other on a genetic level than they are to the Mediterranean species. Thus, zoologists have now placed them on their own branch of the tree of life in a separate genus, Neomonachus, the new monk seals. Because of the amount of variation in their genes, zoologists were also able to estimate that the Hawaiian and Caribbean species were separated into two distinct populations about 3 to 4 million years ago, right around the time geologists estimate that the Isthmus of Panama closed the connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So the genetic data fits the geological data. And you thought zoologists just ran zoos. Well, we do run zoos, and zoos are critical to the kind of work I just described. While most of the time the public sees a zoo as an entertaining and educational way to spend a Sunday afternoon, and it very much is, your average accredited zoo is also a vital part of research and conservation activities going on across the world. Here's where I put my cards on the table. I'm a conservation biologist by training. That means it's my job to study the Earth's biodiversity and figure out ways to protect and preserve it in a way that benefits the individual animals themselves and all life on the planet. That means I do a lot of work outside of zoos. I've worked with species like the pampas deer in Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, and with polar bears up in Canada, to evaluate how these animals interact with their habitats and with humans, and also to evaluate the health of those habitats. We know that our environments are healthier and more resilient if they can keep their historical complement of diversity. A habitat evolves as an integrated system, from the tiny bacteria in the soil to the largest of mammals. When something throws that system off, say a sudden reduction or explosion in the population size of a species, it has a cascade effect on all the other things in that system. We also know that human activities are one of the things that can throw a system out of balance. Pollution, encroachment, introduction of foreign species, creation of monocultures like cornfields, poaching of plants and animals. Human needs and desires often come into conflict with those of the rest of the living things around us. But we need these systems just as much as the animals do. Let's take, for example, the iconic and beautiful monarch butterfly. Every year, some 200 million individual butterflies migrate from their wintering grounds in Mexico and Southern California to their summer habitats. The Californian population spreads across the Rockies, while the Mexican population spreads up the Mississippi Valley and up the Florida Peninsula and through the eastern United States. Monarchs are famously dependent on the 100 or so species of milkweed found in North America. But humans have long regarded milkweed as a weed. We pull it out in favor of all grass lawns, manicured gardens, and purified grass median strips. Although population numbers of monarchs fluctuate from year to year, the Western population has been in steady decline since the mid-1990s, from a high of somewhere around 900 million in 1996 to a low of about 42 million in 2015, a decline of more than 95% in less than 20 years. Numbers improved slightly in 2016 and 2017, but the overall trend line is still downward. This decline means more than the potential loss of a beautiful creature. Like I said, monarchs are dependent on milkweed. It's the sole food of monarch larvae. But adult monarchs have a more varied diet, and in fact, they're important pollinators for about a dozen other plants, including the red clover. Okay, so what's the big deal about red clover? It's one of our best nitrogen-fixing plants. It helps restore nutrients in depleted soil. Farmers use it to improve the quality of the fields where corn and other vegetables are grown. It can also suppress the growth of invasive ragweed in wheat fields, and it has a host of other uses. But to survive, red clover needs monarchs and other pollinators. The monarchs need milkweed for caterpillars to eat. We rip out the milkweed so the monarchs decline, so the red clover might decline, so our agricultural production could suffer. It's all connected. So that's a big part of why zoologists like myself work so hard to save species. The Smithsonian got involved in the race to save the giant panda, for instance, not just because they're so darn cute, although they are, but because they're an important part of the bamboo forest ecosystem. The bamboo itself and the hundreds of other species that live in China's bamboo forests need pandas to survive. The forests are important to the health and economy of the Chinese people, and thus to the world's economy. So, in this course, we're going to talk about the extraordinary efforts scientists go through to help pandas and other animals breed in human care, and what we've learned about animal conservation in general. A lot of work goes into making a giant panda cub like Bebe, and you're going to hear from some of the scientists who made it happen. In fact, you'll hear from a number of experts who are helping to bring animals back from the brink of extinction, like the folks who work with cheetahs at our breeding facility out in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Yes, there are cheetahs in the Blue Ridge. Cheetahs are a particularly interesting case because it's not just about saving the world's biodiversity, but also about fighting to maintain or improve the genetic diversity of a single species. There is so little genetic diversity among the world's remaining cheetahs that unrelated animals can accept skin grafts from one another. Think about how difficult it is to find a match for a human donor organ or even certain human blood types, and you'll realize how remarkable this is. Species with low genetic diversity are more susceptible to disease and to changes in environment than a species with good diversity. So how do zoos help a species develop better genetic diversity? Well, in the case of the cheetah, Smithsonian reproductive biologists manage a species survival plan for North America's Association of Zoos and Aquariums. We keep records of the age and sex distribution of the population, the transfers of cheetahs between facilities, and the breeding of those cheetahs. We evaluate their genetic health and model breeding outcomes with computers in the hope of using this modern computer dating to enhance the genetic makeup of cheetahs both in captivity and in the wild. We also use our studies to help cheetah healthcare in zoos all over the world and in sanctuaries in Africa. And some of my colleagues work with African farmers to develop practices for working with cheetahs in nature, not destroying them when there is cheetah-farmer conflict. As you can see, zoologists do a lot more than run zoos. We study the entire natural world, all the complicated interactions and systems in the environment, and how they can best be managed for the health of the entire planet. So we have a lot to cover in these 24 lectures: taxonomy, biodiversity, ecology, animal behavior, and conservation. We're going to start where a conservation biologist starts, with the basics of reproduction and rearing of young. Then we'll cover the orders of life. That's the over in King Philip Came Over from Germany Saturday, and how certain characteristics define an order, as well as the astounding diversity within orders. Finally, we'll look at some special subjects like animal intelligence and animals and disease for an understanding of how animals interact with their environments with other animals and with us, human animals.